Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Athens, Greece on August 12th, 2024. On July 30th, Israel murdered Hezbollah's top military commander, Fuad Shukr, in Beirut. The following day, the head of Hamas's political wing, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in Iran. Although Israel openly acknowledged that it killed Shukr, it has neither confirmed nor denied that it murdered Haniyeh. Shortly after Haniyeh was killed, however, Israel's press office tweeted a photo of him with the word eliminated stamped across his forehead. It quickly deleted that photo. It is now widely assumed that Israel was, in fact, behind the killing of Haniyeh. Shortly following the murder of Skukr and Haniyeh, both Iran and Hezbollah vowed to respond forcefully to these assassinations. As of today, August 12th, those responses have not yet come, but they could happen at any time. And indeed, West Asia likely stands on the precipice of a war that could be more destructive than any it has experienced thus far. Now here to discuss this with me is Professor Mohammad Marandi. Professor Marandi is an American-born Iranian academic and political analyst. After being born and raised in the United States, he returned to Iran and volunteered to fight in the Iran-Iraq War. He survived 2 chemical weapons attacks and was wounded twice. Professor Marandi was the head of the North American Studies program at the University of Tehran and is currently a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the university. He has appeared as a political and social commentator on international news networks such as Sky News, CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. And he was also a media advisor to the Iranian nuclear negotiation team in Vienna. Professor Marandi, thank you so much for joining me again.
Thank you very much for having me.
And let me say that it was a pleasure to actually briefly meet you in person as you and I were departing the airport in Caracas, Venezuela. I think it was a couple of weeks ago after serving as election observers. Back to having our conversation that we didn't have an opportunity to continue at that time.
It was good meeting you there.
So at this point in time, Professor Marandi, could you give us a sense of what the mood is in Tehran?
People are waiting. The Iranians have said that there is going to be a retaliation. I think that retaliation is inevitable, especially since when in April, the Israeli regime bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing 12 people. The Iranians responded. It was a measured response when they fired drones and missiles against the Israeli regime. But the deterrence that followed Iran's response was limited to 2 or 3 months. And now we have the murder of Mr. Haniyeh. The martyr Ismail Haniyeh was a very close friend of Tehran and Iran and senior Iranian officials. He was a household name in Iran. He was murdered in a government guest house, and it was a violation of Iranian sovereignty, the murder of a close Iranian friend, a friend of Iran, and a violation, of course, of international law, and an insult to Iran's dignity and honor for killing a guest of Iran. So that, alongside with the fact that in the previous case, Iran's response, that the deterrence that we had subsequent to that, that deterrence didn't last. So this time, I think the Iranian response will be more severe.
Now, at this point in time, what is the Iranian government's position with respect to the U.S. involvement in this assassination? And I note in that regard that on the last day of the Russian Federation's term as president of the UN Security Council, so this would have been July 31st, at an emergency session called by, I believe it was China and Algeria to discuss the tensions in the region resulting from these assassinations, the U.S. Ambassador Robert Wood claimed that the U.S. did not have knowledge of nor did participate in the assassination of Haniyeh. According to Iran's government, who killed Haniyeh? How was he killed? And did the U.S. know or participate in the murder?
There's no doubt that the Israeli regime carried out the attack. It is impossible for the regime to be able to launch terror attacks in Iran and to do many of the things that it does against Iran without US support. US logistical support, intelligence support is essential. And of course, not only do US intelligence agencies support the Israelis, but also Western embassies in Tehran. They gather intelligence, and Western governments in our surrounding countries, neighboring countries, they gather intelligence. So the Israelis benefit from the Five Eyes, from US intelligence, from European intelligence, and logistical support. So whether the Americans were directly involved or not really is not relevant. Without American consent, the Israelis really wouldn't be able to behave in this way. And the very fact that after the murders of Iranians inside a diplomatic building in Damascus, the US, the British, and the French, they refused in the UN Security Council to allow the Israeli regime to be condemned. That shows that the Americans support this lawlessness. And so after the murder of Mr. Haniyeh, again, the US, the West, would under no circumstances punish the Israelis. And so they basically support these. And the fact that they do not want Iran to respond means that they want Israel, the regime, to carry out attacks, and then whoever is hit by the regime should remain silent. This is the logic of Western governments and Western political institutions. But of course, this is a reason in itself why the Iranians are going to hit back hard, because the West is not going to prevent the Israelis from carrying out these strikes. Remember, we have to always keep in mind that there's an ongoing Holocaust. There's an ongoing genocide going on in Gaza, and the West supports it. They haven't sanctioned anyone. They continue to provide the regime with ammunition, with weapons, with economic support, and with political cover. So they, without a doubt, they support this Holocaust. They are partners in this Holocaust, and when they support what's going on in Gaza, obviously they won't have a different policy when it comes to bombing Syria or Lebanon or Iran.
Now, there was, I understand, a meeting organized. I believe there was a meeting, a formal meeting of the Conference of Islamic States, and at that meeting, or perhaps prior to it, the Saudi government had some quite choice words for the assassination of Haniyeh, quite harsh, I would say, by comparison to the language that the Saudis typically use in relation to Israel. Have you seen a generally uniform response? Have we seen a generally uniform response from predominantly Muslim states about this? Have they been more or less unanimous in their condemnation of the assassination of Haniyeh?
Yes, there has been a lot of work done by the Iranians to bring about this consensus. But when it comes to action, very little is being done. The Turkish government continues to have ties. Uh, Oil from Baku continues to go through Turkey to the Israeli regime. Jordan continues to support Israel, and they will probably help Israel when the Iranians launch their strike. The Emirates has good relations with the Israeli regime. So nothing much has changed. None of these countries, as well as other countries, have yet to take important steps to isolate the Israeli regime. The heavy lifting is being done by the Iranians, who are supporting the axis of resistance and who've been sanctioned. Iran is under maximum pressure sanctions, basically because of its support for the Palestinian people. That's the reason why we've been sanctioned for all these years. And of course, the burden is also on the resistance in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. But other than that, other countries really haven't done anything to help Gaza.
Well, let's talk about the non-Muslim world, or at least when we're talking about predominantly Muslim states. The Russian Federation would not fall into that category. It too has had a notable response to the assassinations, as has been widely reported. Sergei Shoigu, the former Russian defense minister and current secretary of Russia's Security Council, came to Tehran about a week ago, I believe it was, for discussions with very senior Iranian officials. He, in fact, visited at the invitation of Iran's Supreme National Security Council Secretary General Ali Akbar Ahmadian, as was reported by Iranian media. And we've also seen reports that since then, or around that same time, there have been many flights of Russian military transport planes from Russia to Iran. What do you make of Sergei Shoigu's visit? And do you believe that these suggestions that there is military assistance forthcoming from the Russian Federation are credible?
Well, I don't know much about military the military relationship between Iran and Russia, and I can only say in general terms that Iran and Russia, especially after the war in Ukraine, the relationship has grown much closer. They are developing the North-South transport corridor, which links Russia to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, which will be very beneficial for Russia, but also for Iran. It will also, of course, link Iran to the whole of Russia and Central Asia more effectively, and in a more in a way in which trade and business can be done more easily. That the military relationship has also evolved. Western sources constantly say that Iran is very deeply involved in exporting materials to the Russian military, exporting products, and they claim that Iran, the Russian drones, many of them are Iranian. I can't comment on that, but the same is true with Russian military cooperation with Iran, with Russia's exports to Iran as well. Iran exports goods to Russia, Russia exports goods to Iran, Iran exports military hardware and military goods to Russia, and Russia does the same with Iran. This is not something new. I don't know if over the last few weeks there has been an extra large number of planes or ships that are transporting goods, but I do know that the relationship has evolved significantly, and that the two countries are cooperating a great deal because both countries feel threatened by the West. The West carried out a coup in Ukraine. The West supported fascists in Ukraine. In our part of the world, the West has supported ISIS. Now they support the Israeli regime carrying out a genocide. So the two countries have a lot in common, and so I think cooperation is natural.
And another country that obviously will be watching closely is China. Shortly before the assassination of Haniyeh, this has almost been completely ignored in the Western discourse, public discourse here. China appears to have mediated a détente, shall we say, between the various factions within the Palestinian resistance, and then killed Haniyeh. And I've seen reports which are perfectly logical that the Chinese government is very unhappy about this. Both China and Iran have, China and the Russian Federation have described their relationship with Iran as being of strategic importance to their respective countries. What do you anticipate the Chinese reaction would be if the United States began to apply its full military force to Iran in defense of Israel, and, for example, began bombardment of the country?
Well, I think it's unlikely that the United States will actually attack Iran, because if they do so, that means all US bases in the region are fair game. And those countries that host US bases will be considered as hostile. So these very small city-states that we have in the Persian Gulf, they will cease to exist within hours. The United Arab Emirates would not last very long, neither would any of the other countries in the Persian Gulf. And I think the Iraqi resistance would expel the Americans completely out of Iraq. And you can imagine that if there's no oil or gas coming out of our region, the Persian Gulf and the surrounding region, what that would mean for the global economy. That would mean an economic collapse, far worse, I think, than what we had in 1929. And I think especially since the global economy is in a very bad state as it is, the Americans would be very foolish to engage directly with Iran. Iran does have the capability to destroy all of these. Iran has hundreds of thousands of missiles and drones in many underground bases. That same model has been applied in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Gaza, and in Iraq and Syria. And that's why the American Navy has failed against Yemen. And the Yemeni armed forces, or Ansar Allah, the Houthis, as the West likes to call them, they make the decisions about who passes through the Red Sea and who can't, despite the American Navy trying to defeat them. So Iran is much stronger than Yemen. It's much stronger than any other country in the region, and therefore I think it would be very. It's very. I think it's unlikely that the Americans will engage in a direct conflict. But the Americans, since they've already antagonized Russia, China, and many other countries, they would isolate themselves even further. The global South is not just Islamic countries. This is a humanitarian issue. This is an issue that concerns the whole of humanity. The global South is outraged by what the Israeli regime is doing. Even in countries that had traditionally good relations with Israel, we see the mood changing, like in India. But in the West also, the mood has shifted against the Israeli regime, despite the fact that Western media is universally supporting this genocidal regime. So I don't think there's any benefit for the United States to engage in any conflict. They may, I mean, I'm sure they will try to defend the Israelis against missiles and drones that will be fired in response to the Israeli regime's acts of terrorism. But for the United States to directly engage, that would be devastating for American troops and non-American and Americans who are not, necessarily military, but diplomats or other Americans. All of their assets in Iraq and Syria would be gone very swiftly.
Right. I was actually in Qatar after this genocide began and visited what I understand to be the largest U.S. military base in all of West Asia. That is obviously within easy striking distance, I would imagine, of Iran's military.
Not only the base, the countries that host those bases, if the Americans get into a fight with Iran, those countries would be hostile. And everything that those countries have would be easily destroyed. Everything.
Lastly, before we conclude our discussion today, I'd like to show you a clip from a speech that was given by the Secretary General of Hezbollah on the seventh day following the murder of...
sorry, what I mean is like oil and gas assets and other key infrastructure. Iran definitely would never target civilians, but Iran would definitely bring down the states.
Right, understood. So I would like to show you a clip. It's a bit long. It's a little less than 2 minutes from the speech that Hassan Nasrallah gave on the seventh day after the killing of Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr. And then I'm going to ask you a question about a particular aspect of this speech, which I found particularly interesting.
Sure.
بعد اغتيال الشهيد القائد سيد فؤاد، حزب الله أيضا يرى نفسه ملزما بالرد، وإيران سترد وحزب الله سيرد، والعدو ينتظر ويترقب ويحسب كل صيحة عليه يحسبها هي الرد، مثل ما عم بيصير بالأيام الماضية. اليمن بعد قصف الحديدة هو أيضا ألزم نفسه بالرد وسيرد. المهم هنا في هذه الجبهات الثلاث التصميم والقرار والعزم موجود. ثانيا أؤكد لكم أن القدرة أيضا موجودة. وثالثا كما ذكرت في التشييع التصرف بروية، بأنات، بتأني، وأيضا بشجاعة. وليس بانفعال، انه يلا ضربني قوموا لينا ننضرب، يواش يواش، شوي شوي. اساسا اليوم هذا الانتظار الاسرائيلي، هلا كنا نقول على اجر ونص، مدري من قريت من يومين على اجر وربع، يعني شوي يعلوا الاجر شويه. الانتظار الاسرائيلي على مدى اسبوع هو جزء من العقاب، هو جزء من الرد.
So the part of this, it was all quite interesting, actually. And I think in many ways, this speech is antithetical to the stereotype of, resistance leaders, that they are, maniacal haters of Israel and act out of inflamed passions irrationally. In fact, what we're seeing is quite the opposite. And what really struck me about this speech was when Sayyid Nasrallah said, that the waiting is part of the punishment. And now this is we're almost a week beyond that speech. And I saw an interesting article in the Times of Israel. There's been a number of articles like this in the Israeli press about, Israelis at Ben Gurion debating whether they should stay or whether they should go. And my question to you is this, Professor Marandi. We in the West tend to talk about a possible full-blown conflict between Iran and Israel as being a question of whether or not one side can militarily defeat the other. I happen to be of the view, and I'm interested in your reaction to this, that the bar is not that high for Iran and for the resistance generally. If they succeed by military means or otherwise in destroying this sense of impunity and sense of security that the Zionist colonists have enjoyed since the creation of Israel, and instill in them a kind of permanent sense of fear about the capacities of the resistance to retaliate, that'll have potentially disastrous and fatal consequences for the Zionist project, because Israel will ultimately end up losing this dreaded demographic war that they've been talking about for decades, and they will simply, at some point in time, become so outnumbered by the indigenous Palestinian population, they'll no longer be able to dominate them. Do you think that in and of itself could be fatal to the Zionist regime, that loss of sense of security and impunity that they've enjoyed for so long?
Well, first, I should point out that I think it's actually, as you were pointing out, true, the exact opposite, that the resistance is very calculating, it's very rational, very careful in the way in which it acts. Whereas it is the Israelis and their allies that are full of hatred. They see Palestinians as Amalek. They want to wipe them out. Their soldiers rape Palestinians, and they are supported on TV, and they're defended, and bring the rapist on television to defend himself, and he's free. They slaughter Palestinians from morning to night, children, without any remorse. And Western regimes and Western media support them and hide the reality. So I think, contrary to these stereotypes that they create about Iranians and the resistance, those stereotypes really are more similar, are better descriptions of what the Israelis are like, or what Zionists are like, or what their supporters in the West are like. I think that Israel is definitely not a strong regime. It's very weak. As we've seen, it's completely dependent on the United States, on the Europeans, on help from Western governments. And without their full support, ammunition, weapons, financial support, political cover, they would cease to exist in a very short period of time. The regime would fall. What Iran and the resistance wants to do is to bring about an end to this apartheid regime. It's sort of like through what they say, death by a thousand cuts, something like that.
Yes.
They want to degrade it, to weaken it. The region is not looking for a war. We don't want to disrupt the lives of people in the region and across the world. We're not looking for a regional war. What the resistance wants to do is to weaken the Israeli regime in a way in which it collapses. And it could be, part of it would be some Zionists leaving Palestine. A lot of it would be foreigners leaving Palestine. A lot of it would be the lack of investment in future, because I've spoken to many Chinese experts, and they say that no one is going to invest in Israel anymore from China. And that's where the money is going. The economy is tilting away from the West. The West is on the decline at a time when the Israeli regime is on the decline. So Israel is no longer going to be a land for investment, and therefore many jobs will be lost. And of course, Israel is hated across the world now. It's not just the region or Muslim countries. It's anywhere where there are human beings that have a sense of humanity and who have even a limited amount of information. They despise the regime. So I think it is destined to fail. The Zionist project will not last. It's um, not going to collapse this week or next week or in next month or next year, perhaps. But I think that these are the dying years or the final years of the Israeli regime.
And on the question of economics, again, not widely reported in the West, but Intel, the American technology behemoth, canceled or at least suspended a $25 billion investment in Israel a few weeks ago. And that, I understand, was the crown jewel of Israel's foreign investment program.
Absolutely. And that's just one example. That is a big example. But there are many mid-sized investors, large investors, small investors who will no longer be looking at Palestine, because they know that it could be hit by, their investments could be destroyed in the next war, in the next exchange between Lebanon and the Israeli regime, or Gaza and the Israeli regime, or Iran, or Yemen, or Iraq and the Israeli regime. This regime is not going to be able to go back to October the 6th. That era is over. And I think that investors are people who are extremely cautious about their money. And since also the Israeli regime has such a horrible image, and since it's now despised so widely across the world, I don't think many investors would like to go there for moral reasons as well, even if some of them may not be the most moral people, but it is a reason to stay away.
Well, again, I'd like to thank you for joining me again today, Professor Marandi, and I hope we can continue our discussion in the future, and perhaps we'll have an opportunity to meet in Tehran in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much for having me.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Athens, Greece on August 12, 2024.